Доброго дня, колеги, доброго дня. Раді вас тут всіх бачити. Бачу, що в чаті вже вітають нас всіх і одне одного. Мене звати Яна Чапайло. Я сьогодні з вами маю нагоду спілкуватися з Києва, з Офісу Американських Рад. Я координаторка проєкту «Ініціатива академічної доброчесності та якості освіти». І сьогодні ми з вами говоритимемо про академічну доброчесність, про мотивацію робити чесні або нечесні вчинки. Загалом поговоримо, напевно, що про більш такі якісь філософські поняття, адже коли ми вчиняємо чи не вчиняємо якісь певні рішення, зазвичай за кожним з цих рішень є причина і потім, відповідно, наслідок. Я дякую вам сьогодні за те, що знайшли час доєднатися до нас. І надзвичайно мені приємно сьогодні представити нашого спікера. Його звати Девід Реттінгер. Він професор психологічних наук і директор академічних програм доброчесності в Університеті Мері Вашингтон в Сполучених Штатах. Він також є почесним президентом Міжнародного центру з академічної доброчесності. І мені теж надзвичайно приємно сказати про те, що Міжнародний центр з академічної доброчесності є офіційним партнером нашого проєкту і університетів, і шкіл, які беруть участь в цій ініціативі. У нас сьогодні в кімнаті більше ніж 300 людей. Нагадаю, що в Zoom доступний переклад на українську мову, оскільки лекція буде проходити англійською. Також нагадаю, що для того, щоб почути нашу перекладачку пані Інну і її українську, вам потрібно обрати рядочок португальської, тому що Zoom все ще ніяк не веде українську мову в список мов для перекладу. У нас також відбувається трансляція на YouTube-каналі нашого проєкту, тож я передаю вітання усім, хто сьогодні нас дивиться на YouTube. Будь ласка, стежте за тим, аби ваші мікрофони були вимкнені, щоб ми не перебивали нашого спікера сьогодні. Проте ми завжди раді запитанням. Якщо ви маєте запитання, будь ласка, пишіть їх в чаті. Так само слухачі, глядачі на YouTube, якщо ви маєте запитання, залишайте їх, будь ласка, в чаті, в стрічці під відео на Ютубі. Запис цього відео буде доступний українською та англійською мовами на Ютубі. Ми обов'язково надішлемо усім зареєстрованим також супровідні матеріали, з якими з нами поділився Девід, і будемо раді долучатися до дискусії. Тож, без окремих уже, напевно, що затримок, я передаю слово Девіду Реттінгеру. Бажаю нам сьогодні цікавої розмови, цікавої дискусії. Ось, і з нетерпінням чекаю його виступу. Дякую вам. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yana. Thank you all for being here, and I apologize for not being able to do this in Ukrainian. I'm always amazed at the ability of folks who are able to do their work in languages other than their first language. It's a very impressive thing to me that I'm not able to do. I'm very grateful to all of you for devoting some of your time today to listen to me and to this really important topic, and really grateful to the American councils for making it possible for this to happen, especially to Yana. So thank you all. So today, let me also warn you that I'm assisted today by two small dogs who may decide to protect me from things like cars and garbage. So if that happens, I apologize in advance. They're sleeping now, so we have a fighting chance. So they're small, but they're mighty. So what I'd like to do today is talk with you a little bit, put my psychologist hat on and talk with you a bit about the psychology of academic integrity. I'll introduce you to some of the major work in the field, some of which I've done, but most of which has been done by other folks who have been interested in this question, fundamentally, of why students cheat. It's a really important question for all of us in academics, but it turns out it's actually a really important question even beyond academics for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it's important because cheating is just the tip of the iceberg. It's a metaphor that I really like because it's a thing that you see, but it's connected to lots of things that you might not necessarily think of as being connected. And so it's easy to imagine that what we do is to train students to be academics. But it's a very reasonable thing to say is what we're doing is part of a much larger enculturation into the society that we wish to have. And so in some work that I did with some of my students, which I'm particularly proud of because it's both important and amusing,
Здравствуйте.
we found that cheating in school was associated with things like relationship cheating. If you Google cheating, you get some really interesting things, by the way. Cheating in social settings, so things like mind cutting and other kinds of very minor corruption. Cheating in sports and games. We all have friends who cheat when we play Monopoly or tennis or something. Cheating at work, right? Taking credit for the work of other people, lying to customers, inflation of insurance claims. One of my favorite findings from this work is that there was a high association between cheating in relationships and cheating in what we call high occupancy vehicle lanes. So vehicles that require carpools to use them. So someone who's likely to cheat on a carpool lane is likely to cheat in a relationship. And so I always suggest that that's a really useful first date test. Take someone see if they'll go into the high occupancy vehicle lane. If they will, then you might think of it as a warning sign. I actually think of it more as a warning sign for trying to mine large data sets for interpretation without theory. But the big picture point here has to be that academic integrity is not just about academic integrity. It's about helping our students to build the tools that will create skills for life, for helping them to address the temptations and the challenges that will face them in life. So when we talk about the social science of cheating, there's one fact that's just absolutely most important that I want, if you come away with no other concepts from this talk, I would like you to come away with this one, which is that cheaters are just like us. And in fact, many of us are cheaters in some context, right? We're all to some extent hypocrites. Nina Mazar has talked about this a lot in her work, especially that with Dan Ariely. The short version of this is that everyone has their price, and everyone has a context in which they would do something that they might have otherwise said, yeah, I would never do that. I'll give you a very simple example that I think is pretty powerful. If you ask me on any given day, are you a safe driver? Are you the kind of driver who puts other people at risk while you're on the road? I would say, no, I'm not. It says a value. I value other people's life and safety. And then one day, my then 9-year-old daughter cut her hand with a carving knife, right? And so she's bleeding all over the place. Turns out it's fine. She was just a superficial cut in a place where there was a lot of blood. But as any parent might, I kind of panicked. And so we wrapped her up and we put some ice on it and it wouldn't stop bleeding. So we decided to take her to the urgent care. Let us just say that my driving on the way to the urgent care did not meet my normal safety standards. Right? That would be the polite way to put it. The people who saw me that day would probably have said, that guy's a lunatic. The lesson there is that I have my price, and it was more than met by the sight of my daughter's blood. Right? And so you might say, well, sure, I can understand it in that situation. Or you might be saying, well, how could you not control your emotions and get yourself those 2 miles, 4 kilometers or whatever to the hospital? And the answer to that is I don't know how I couldn't, but I didn't. I did not meet my own standards at that moment. The same things are true in the context of academic integrity. You can ask a student on Monday, is it wrong to copy and paste someone else's work into your paper? And that student will very confidently and with heart and honestly say to you, yes, that's wrong, and that's not something I would do. By Wednesday, Thursday, the stress comes along. They are afraid they're not going to pass their class. They're afraid they might lose their place in university. Suddenly, well, not suddenly, but gradually, their position changes. And so the lesson here is that when we think about academic misconduct, we need to think about ourselves and not think about some mysterious group of other people who are different or maybe not as well developed as we are, because this can be any of us in the right context. And so it's really important to start from there. And instead of ask the question, how do we separate ourselves from those people? Because that's an easy question to answer. It's not easy to do, but it's easy to answer. A much harder question is, how do we raise each individual student's price? How do we make cheating or misconduct less and less desirable in the given moment, and authentic, meaningful learning more tempting in a particular moment? So once we've established the simple notion that anyone can do it, anyone might do it, then why do people do it? And maybe when do they do it is an appropriate question. So why students cheat? I'll start in plain language, and then we'll translate that a little bit to some of the psychological jargon. So why do students cheat? In very simple terms, because they need to. What does it mean that they need to? Well, it means that at least in their own mind, they believe they can't do the work the right way. What they're being asked to do is not something they can do the way you're asking them to do it as a faculty member. So that might mean that they don't feel competent to do the work, that they haven't learned enough, or they might feel that there's too much work in the time that they have, or they might need a particular high grade that they don't feel they can meet. Because they need to takes on a lot of different versions. We call that self-efficacy in psychology, by the way. Number two is because they can, and this is a big contextual this is a big category of contextual sorts of variables. So students who can cheat, by that I mean that information is available online, that the assignment is readily accessible for dishonesty. Some assignments are easier to cheat on than others, and some contexts are easier to cheat in than others. And then third, and maybe this is the most complex of the three, is because it doesn't matter. And because it doesn't matter, what I mean there is that our students don't always understand the needs and the values of their education in the same way that we as their instructors and university leaders see their education. And so once that happens, once they see their education in different terms than we do, then what's important about their education to us may not be what's important about their education to them. And so if that's the case, then the learning that comes with authentic work is maybe not their highest priority. And once it happens that the learning that's not stops being their highest priority, then cheating becomes a very viable option. So what I'd like to do is go into each of these in a little bit of depth and talk about some of the psychological research that supports my claims here. So first I want to talk about individual causes, and by individual causes, what I refer to here is things about people that might cause them to be more or less likely to cheat. Now, I don't necessarily mean things that are fixed or stable about people. Some of these things are things that change in psychology. We'll talk about those. Then we'll talk about situations, context, things you as a faculty member or as an institutional leader can maybe influence. And then, time permitting, we'll talk about some of the cultural and social causes. And these, while they differ in different national contexts, there are some worldwide trends that I think are very relevant to all of us. So let's first start with individual causes. What I'd like to do is I'll go through this section on individual causes. As Jana said, if you have any questions that are pressing, that are about clarity, please let me know right away in the chat and someone will break in. At the end of the individual causes section, we'll take some sort of more open questions about that, and we'll do the same at each of the other sections as well. So what I'd like to do is start by talking about values, motivation, what we call neutralizing attitudes. I'll explain that in a minute, but it's rationalization essentially. And then self-efficacy, which, as I indicated, is a really important element of students' decision to cheat. So let's start at the beginning, and this relates to the cheaters are like all of us statement. Is cheating okay? Right? Because one of the most critical concepts here is that a student who believes cheating or a particular act of cheating to be acceptable is much more likely to commit a dishonest act than a student who doesn't believe that act is dishonest, right? So we want to try to figure out to what extent do students know what's right and what's wrong. So Nina Mazar, Dan Ariely have done some research. It's called self-concept maintenance theory. And the idea of self-concept maintenance theory essentially says that everyone wants to see themselves as honest. It's important to realize that this isn't entirely true, right? There's any number of folks out there who are sociopaths who don't really believe that the rules apply to them. It's a relatively small number. It's probably less than 5%, but it's an important group to think about, but we'll think about them separately. So of those 95% of people who think of themselves as basically honest people, they'll cheat of just about as much as their concept of the self as an honest person can take, right? Because no one wants to think of themselves as a cheater in this context. So what that means is they'll cheat as much as their conscience will allow. People will cheat as long as it doesn't interfere with that self-concept. So it's sensitive to things like the severity and frequency of cheating, the framing of behavior, something we call category malleability, social norms and salience of their own values. So there's a lot of really cool little studies here that we can talk about, some of which when we talk about the context variables. But the framing of variables and category malleability is really important. So a great example of this from the non-cheating context comes from what I call vacation money. How many of you bought something on vacation where you thought, well, I would have never bought that at home? It's a souvenir. It's okay. It's a part of my vacation budget, right? We all have stuff like that. And it's okay to do that. But what we do is we move that thing from our tacky shirt category, where we'd have never bought that thing if it was part of our clothing budget, because you know you're never going to wear it except on vacation. But if it's a souvenir, that's a completely different set of money. Right. And so changing the category of an act can allow you to do something that you otherwise wouldn't do. It's not cheating. It's helping my friend get through school. It's not cheating. It's saving time so I can spend it with my family. Right. And so if you can shift that if you can shift the category of the behavior, then suddenly it's not affecting your self-concept anymore. So that's a very important notion when it comes to academic misconduct, is that if people can convince themselves that it's okay for one reason or another, they're much more able to do it. This is what's been described in what's called the attitude change model, which comes from works primarily from Sykes and Matza, which is an amazingly interesting study all the way back in 1957 on juvenile delinquency. And what they claimed is that juvenile delinquents know what's right from wrong, but they choose to do things that are wrong because they're able to convince themselves that in a particular instance, this behavior is acceptable for whatever reason. This has been applied by people like Trevor Harding, Jason Stevens, Eric Anderman, me, to think about academic misconduct, right? So there's two sets of variables that interact here. One are what I call valence attitudes, and these are the how wrong is this behavior, right? So students definitely have different perspectives on different behaviors as to how wrong they think these things are, right? And so, for example, working together on a homework assignment. My understanding is that there's maybe not quite as much of these little small homework assignments in a typical Ukrainian university class than we might have in the US. But these are like in engineering, you might have a problem set or something like that. Those are small and students often work together on them. And so even if you say they can't, they might do it anyway. And if you ask them, is that really bad? Like, how bad is that? They'll say, that's not really bad. Whereas if you said, well, what if I were to buy a doctoral dissertation from an online source, having put no work into it whatsoever? They'd probably say, yeah, that's very bad. And so as you might guess, on average, if a student thinks a thing is very bad, they're less likely to do it than if they think it's not so bad, right? That's a pretty high correlation at about 0.59 from some work that I did. But then here's where it gets interesting. If you ask them, are you able to rationalize this behavior? And so by rationalize, we say, well, is there a higher good that you can appeal to? Is there a reason to blame the professor for why you're doing what you're doing? Is there no victim? Is there no real harm that comes from doing it? These are some classic neutralizing attitudes. The more easily a student is able to think of those and endorse them, the more likely they are to endorse doing the behavior. And that's positively correlated with cheating at about 0.52. But here's where it gets interesting. There's an interaction. For those of you who are social scientists out there, this is ringing some bells. What this means is that the valence isn't as important when the neutralizing attitudes are high. So you could basically switch off or disengage your moral values if you're able to persuade yourself that it's not really a moral issue. So this is what happens with a lot of academic misconduct, is students just simply don't realize or choose not to realize that their morals are in play here. My wife describes this in a movie metaphor. She says in a movie, when something bad's about to happen, there's creepy music on the soundtrack. And so you always wonder, why are these people going into the empty house? It's obviously dangerous because there's creepy music playing. In life, there's rarely creepy music when you're about to do something that's morally ambiguous. And so neutralizing attitudes are your ability to turn down the creepy music. Okay, does that all mostly make sense? So neutralizing and valence attitudes, this attitude change model is hugely influential. And so it also leads us to a lot of conversations about what we can do about academic misconduct. One of the things, the first piece of advice I'll give to you if you're trying to reduce academic misconduct is make sure they know what you expect of them. In other words, make it harder for them to think that the behavior is okay. In other words, increase their valence attitudes. Number two, make it hard for them to neutralize. Talk about what their responsibility is. Don't make them mad. By which I simply mean be a decent partner to your students. This doesn't mean you have to coddle them, but you can at least listen to them when they talk, and this is going to create a bond that's going to make it harder for them to neutralize. Another really important value with respect to students' attitudes towards school is motivation. And this is work by Eric Anderman. He's really the leader in research around the world in motivation towards school, and he's applied it to academic misconduct, among many other things. I apologize for the font on this slide. I don't know how I got that light blue going there. So what Anderman's work for decades now has talked about is intrinsic and extrinsic motivation towards learning. Intrinsic motivation towards learning refers to this idea that you actually care about school for the sake of the learning and the knowledge and the process itself. And so students who are intrinsically motivated will endorse things like, I really care about being able to do the work that's assigned. I really care a lot about, it's important to me to be competent. It's important to me to know the material, to be capable. Students who endorse extrinsic attitudes say things like, I'm in school to get a job. I'm here for my parents' approval or societal approval. It was expected of me. I don't really know why I'm here. Right? Those are extrinsic kinds of values. In other words, they're getting some reward that's outside of doing the work itself. Now, these are separate things. I'm sure many of you have met students who are both genuinely love the learning, but also have strong expectations for what that learning will provide them. Right? That's pretty normal. But what you find is the students who are at highest risk for academic misconduct are ones who are highly motivated by extrinsic motivators and not very motivated by intrinsic motivators. And so this is some work. I think this graph is actually from some work that I've done, but it's replicated by Anderman and Kowenka just a couple of years ago. It's very clear. Students who are not motivated by learning are much more likely to be dishonest. Now, I know what you're thinking. How on earth do I change my students' motivations towards learning? Isn't this a really fundamental aspect of who they are? And the answer is yes, it is, and it's hard to change. But one of the things that Anderman's work, especially with Tamara Murdoch, has shown is that context can make a huge difference in cueing students as to what kind of motivations to have. This kind of motivation towards school changes course by course, class by class. And so when we talk about context, we can talk a lot about how you can build a class to create this intrinsic motivational structure. Lastly, in this context, I really want to address self-efficacy because it's super important. In this work by Tamara Murdoch, as well as some of her graduate students, what she did is essentially did some interventions to try to help the students, and these are secondary school students and younger. These are not even university students. They tried to persuade them. They did some work to intervene to help students believe they could do the work honestly. And what they find is that high-performing students tend to have relatively high self-efficacy, and they're less likely in that case to engage in misconduct. And as grades go down, misconduct goes up, especially when those grades are low, because the student doesn't believe they can do the work. So this is also connected with their learning motivation. If they're really interested in doing the work, it doesn't matter what grade they're getting, they're still going to do the work honestly. But what Murdoch finds is that giving students scaffolds, we call it, in educational design. So instead of giving them a giant project and saying, I'll see you in 3 months, go do the project, you give them feedback at intermediate steps. My students, for example, I teach a research and psychology course. If I just said to them, give me a research paper in 3 months, my students wouldn't be able to do that. Some of them would, the best ones would, but many of them, even though they could absolutely do the work, their anxiety would get the better of them, and the stress would create problems that they might not be able to overcome. So what do I do? Well, I give them the exact same assignment. I just give them intermediate due dates. So just today, I got proposals from my students, and it was, what's your topic going to be? What are you going to deliver to me? What are some key research items that you're going to use to start your work? The vast majority of them do a really nice job with that. I make it really easy, and I make the grading on it really easy. So they all start with a success experience. They all say in the first couple of weeks of the class, oh, I can do this. Now it gets harder, believe me, and not everybody gets a good grade in my class. But I want it to not be because they're afraid to try. And so this self-efficacy variable can make a big difference. So I want to turn next to situational causes, but before I do, I want to take a moment to see if there are any questions that are pressing that I can address for a couple of minutes. If they're in the chat, hopefully someone will read them. And if
David, not yet.
Not yet, we're good? So then we will continue. All right, so another big picture point that I want to address. I know in a group this size, there are bound to be some economists in the room. And so let me just apologize to you right now, but I'm a decision-making researcher by training, and this is before there was really such a popular notion as behavioral economics. So if you take, how shall I put this politely? Rational behavior theory, while not incorrect, does not do a very good job of explaining why students cheat. And the reason for this is that many of the motivators, the incentives, the things that would give value to dishonest behavior or to honest behavior are internal to the student. So this doesn't mean that they're not economically real, they are. But to understand the internal motivations of a person, economics is not really the tool set that you want to use. You really want to use behavioral economics in this context, or psychological methods, which overlap a great deal. So one of the reasons we know that this rational economic model is not optimal has to do with the ineffectiveness of changing incentives in stopping cheating, right? And so incentives in this case, by incentives, I mean disincentives, right? So ask yourself this question: would you do something that you could get caught and punished for if there was no gain? No, of course not. No one would risk punishment for no reason. Well, except that people cheat all the time on very low stakes graded assignments, right? Where taking a 0 on this assignment is going to have no material effect on your grade, right? They copy those homeworks all the time, where if you could do even basic arithmetic, you would see that a 0 on this assignment would have no effect on your final outcomes. So clearly there's something more to this going on. Similarly, students who would dramatically benefit from misconduct because the chance of getting caught is very low often won't do it, right? So clearly the incentives and disincentives for misconduct are much, much greater than simply a cost-benefit analysis of external values might indicate. And so we as psychologists and behavioral scientists across the board need to try to understand those motivators a little bit better if we want to change the context. So here's some cool work that I did. This is with some undergraduate students, which is why it never got published, but it's actually pretty nice work. What essentially they did is they asked their peers a couple of questions about their perception of life at our institution. And they asked them, all right, if you were to cheat tomorrow, how likely do you think someone would report you? How likely is that? They similarly also asked them, how serious do you think your punishment would be if that happened tomorrow? And in a different part of the study, we also asked them about their own misconduct behavior. And so what you would imagine is that students who think their likelihood of detection, that the likelihood of detection increases are going to be less likely to engage in misconduct. Similarly, students who think the severity of punishment is more severe are less likely to engage in misconduct, right? Makes sense economically, except it doesn't work. The severity of punishment had no impact whatsoever in predicting students' misconduct. What mattered was likelihood of detection. Why is this? Well, there are lots of explanations, and I should point out that this doesn't work in the lab either. In the lab, both of these variables have an influence on people's behavior. Well, and I think the reason for this is that likelihood of detection has a much wider range than severity of punishment does. Some students are fairly confident that there's no chance they'll be caught. Other students have this very broad imagination of theirs, you know, someone will report them as around every corner, and they believe they'll certainly be caught. Another way of saying this is multiplication works here, right? A severe punishment times zero chance of getting caught is still zero. Similarly, a small punishment with a high probability of getting caught is going to end up having a large expected value. And so at the bottom line, my recommendation is if you're thinking about institutional policies, don't go for the severe punishment unless you're willing to back it up. There's a very well-known American university, which I will not name, has an honor code, which is what we call these policies in which students, among other things, are dismissed from the university if they're found responsible for even a minor case of misconduct. There's no chance for education or rehabilitation. Guess what? This enormous 30,000 student university had 7 cases last year reported to their academic integrity system, even in COVID times. Does this tell you that this system works? Well, that's their interpretation. My interpretation is that faculty have just decided they're opting out of this system because they're not willing to expel a student for a minor violation. And once students feel like the likelihood of detection gets very low, even this severe punishment is not going to deter them. So it's really important to recognize that students are very sensitive to this likelihood of detection for a number of reasons. One of them has to do with this idea of social norms influencing misconduct. Social norms, so in the real world, social norms matter a lot. In some work that Jillian O'Rourke did, this is out of my lab as well, social norms affect people's beliefs. So the beliefs I talked about last time, one of the origins of those beliefs are what people see in the world. This is a straightforward application of social learning theory. Okay, so we can talk about these self-justification or neutralizing attitudes, and you can see they're still highly associated with self-reported cheating. Cheating valence, again, is highly associated with self-reported cheating. But here's where it gets interesting. Belief in peer cheating is also highly associated with dishonesty. In other words, the more a student believes that everyone else around them is committing these acts, the more likely they are to do them themselves. In one of my absolutely favorite pieces of research on this topic, Carell Malmstrom and West, did an economic study of misconduct at the U.S. military service academies. And it's economic style work. It's absolutely brilliant math. And what they found essentially is for every increased number of students who admitted to cheating in secondary school, that created about 1 new cheater for every 3 cheaters, pre-existing cheaters. So for every 3 pre-existing cheaters that arrive at your campus, they create 1 more. And then for every student who cheats at their campus, for every 4 that cheat while they're there, they create 3 more. It's about 0.75 to 1. So in COVID times, this is a really simple analogy. Cheating is contagious with an R naught with a contagion of about 0.3 to 0.7, depending on the context. Seeing other students do this behavior, and especially if you see them not being punished for it, dramatically increases the chances that you will do it yourself. Right? So you can bring this into the lab and you can see some really interesting social psychological phenomena. This is Francesca Gino's work. What they did, I love this study. It's just such an elegant little experiment. So what they did is they had a group of students that was mixed between two universities. These are two universities that are on that share a physical space, but they're two separate schools, and they have a little bit of a rivalry. We're having some technical problems here. Can everyone still hear me okay?
Excuse me, David.
Yes.
We have some issues. One of the participants, we just can't. Колеги, зам'ютьте, будь ласка, мікрофони, тому що ми чуємо вас і звук перебиває Девіда. Дуже дякую. Yeah, thank you, David. I'm sorry.
Sure. I'll start backward. I love this study. It's a laboratory experiment. So lots of research that I've been talking about have been surveys. I love experiments. I'm an experimental psychologist by training, if not by actual practice. So they have these two groups of students who are mixed together from different universities that are right across the street from one another in Pittsburgh, I think. And so what they did is they created a study. It's the fake paper shredder study. And so what they do is they give students a set of math problems. Give students a set of math problems that and those students are either in one of two conditions. They're either in a condition where they're control condition in which it's easy for the grader to know how many questions the student got right. And so we're going to ask you as a student, how many did you get right? And then we're going to check it. Right? That's the control condition. And when that happens, students get about 7 questions right. Then in the shredder condition, what we do is we say, all right, take your paper, put it in the shredder so no one can know how you did, and then tell us how many you got right. So this is the cheating condition. People can cheat as much as they like, and in theory, we'd never know. Now, like I said, it's a fake paper shredder. So what that means is that we, of course, know how they did. By the way, in case you're wondering, yes, I have a fake paper shredder in my office now. So you can see this gap here is the dishonesty gap when they can get away with it. So it goes from about 7 to about 12. Now here's what's cool. They then have 2 conditions in which they bring in a confederate. And if you're not familiar with psychological research, what this means is they have a person who works for the study who pretends to be a subject in the study. And that person is either wearing a sweatshirt of the school that the students go to, or a sweatshirt of the other school, the rival school, right? And so then what they do is they have that person just flagrantly, blatantly, and dramatically cheat, right? So instead of doing the math problems after about 5 seconds, they say, got them all right, run it through the shredder and collect their money. So this person just flagrantly dishonest. Well, when you witness someone wearing a sweatshirt from your university cheat, see what happens, that the amount of cheating goes up. You take that social cue and say, oh, people like me cheat, it's okay. But here's where it gets fun. If you show them somebody cheating from the hated rival, the number goes down. It's almost as low as the control, right? And so what you see is compared to the shredder group where cheating with no social cue, people take social cues from their environment. And so if you see dishonesty around you, and you feel like it's socially acceptable, like in this condition, you're more likely to do it. If you see dishonesty around you and it feels less socially acceptable, you're less likely to do it. This is obviously going to provide us as instructors with some ideas about what we can do about academic misconduct, which is we have to engage our honest students in communicating values to our students who are on the fence. Right? You have to engage those social norms at your institutions. Most of your students don't cheat most of the time, I hope. And so the goal there is to engage with those students who don't cheat most of the time and help them think about why that is, what context those are. It also helps to build classroom structures that encourage honesty rather than dishonest behavior. Right? Here's another example of things you can do and things you don't want to do. So this is some more work from Nina Mazar, who did some of that great research that I talked about earlier. I don't want to go through the details of these graphs. What I just want to highlight here is so here's your control. Here's the easy to cheat conditions. Now, what the HC here refers to as a class honor code. So what essentially she did is, with no means of enforcement whatsoever, just ask people to promise they would be honest. That's it. Just say, please be honest and promise me you'll be honest. She does that. And then the honor code takes people from the recycle condition to the control condition. The other thing I want you to notice here is the incentive for cheating. So here, this is 50 cents. This is half a US dollar. And then the gray bar is $2. So it's a difference of a fourfold difference. Look who's doing more cheating in the easy to cheat condition. It's the cheap incentive, not the expensive incentive. So you might argue this is a cognitive dissonance situation. So people don't want to see themselves as dishonest, quite so dishonest. Like I'll steal 50 cents. I won't steal $2, right? So it's interesting to note that incentives are not necessarily what you want to work with when you're trying to reduce misconduct. You want to work with people's own intrinsic values. People, even if they don't care much about the work itself, they care about being seen as honest people, and they care about things like keeping their word to a person, to a particular individual. And so that's why this is a useful, valuable mechanism. So to review, extrinsic kinds of incentives and disincentives really are not where the action is. Where the action is, if you want to really affect misconduct, is to look at the likelihood of being caught. The other thing you want to do is create situations that engage students' motivations. You want to give them work. You change your class structure so that you're creating work where they believe they can do the work successfully. And you want to engage their values, their ethical values towards work, by making them promise to do the work honestly, and also by giving them positive tools for actually being able to do the work. It's a lot easier to get a student to do the right thing if you tell them what the right thing is. We spend a lot of time in academic misconduct work telling students what not to do. Right? Think about it. Don't plagiarize. Don't forget your citations. Don't copy this. Don't do that. But instead, but what we maybe should spend more time doing is talking to our students about what the alternative, how they should do it. Plan your time better. Start the work sooner. Here's a schedule you might use. Think about how to fill in your own schedule that makes sense. Having trouble with citations? Here's a book you can refer to. Here's, in the US institutions, we have writing tutorial centers where you can go and get support for these sorts of things. Spending time telling students what not to do. It's important to tell them what's expected of them, and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. But you can do this in a way that substitutes a positive behavior for a negative behavior. If you're a parent, you've probably experienced this, or a pet owner, you've experienced this as well. Just saying no to a kid over and over again doesn't actually help near as much as what we used to call, when my daughter was young, distract a baby. If she's doing a behavior we don't want her to do, we would distract her, direct her to something else, and then reward her for that other behavior. And then over time, she would learn to do the other thing because it was rewarded, rather than the thing we didn't want her to do, which ultimately she just forgot about. That behavior extinguished itself. And so you can do this as well, because you can give students a much, much more positive learning experience by giving them some alternative behaviors. Are there, you know what, instead of taking questions now, let me just briefly touch on some of these important cultural and societal issues that are affecting our students, both in the US and around the world, and in Ukraine, I think. First one I want to talk about, and I think this is universally true, is what has been called the commodification of higher education. In other words, people are going to school to have a degree more to have a degree and less to have an education. Right? You want that piece of paper, that diploma, that things that hangs on your wall that certifies you as ready to go into the workforce, as a member of society of a certain rank. Right? And so I know it's true in the US. I suspect it's true in Ukraine, that your universities are ranked and organized, and so there's prestige that's clearly delineated based on your rank in your class and your graduation. There's an emphasis on fields in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, that are seen to be more prestigious. And so society points higher education as a career starter, not as a public good. And having an educated population is not the reason why we're supporting our students in school. If this sounds a whole lot like extrinsic motivation on a societal level, that's what I would argue is happening. And to the extent that this is happening, our students internalize the idea that what they need to do is get done, graduate, come out with good grades, get a good job, and that is what it means to get a university education. Well, if we tell them that, then they're going to not worry so much about the process by which they go from beginning to end of that education. And misconduct is going to seem like a perfectly reasonable path to get from where they're starting to where they're ending, because they don't see any distinction between a degree earned and a degree bought, because the goal is to have the degree, not the education. So we as our societies, and in Ukraine, I think you have a tremendous opportunity, because as an entire higher education ecosystem, there's really engagement on this issue, and you have an opportunity to speak with one voice, to talk about this as a question of what kind of Ukraine do you want to have? And this is the beginning of the way that we all in our nations end the corruption that's creeping or growing across our countries, right? Is by having the most competent people graduating university with skills and knowledge. I think we're all facing this challenge. Part of this it results from what we call a devaluation of expertise. Tom Nichols has written about this in the US. And I think this is true and very problematic. I think that around the world, there's been a strong political motivation towards authoritarianism, and authoritarianism is undermined by expertise and knowledge. And so it's a standard technique around the world to undermine expertise because it represents a challenge to authority, right? And so when students and their families are told that 20-minute research on Google is an equivalent amount of knowledge to a person with a doctorate in epidemiology on the questions of whether a mask is an effective response to COVID, it's very hard to persuade people to wear masks when 20 minutes on Google or a YouTube video, no offense to those of you watching on YouTube, is an equivalent amount of knowledge, right? It's a huge challenge. It creates a neutralizing attitude, to go back to the middle section, that says that learning in school doesn't matter. What matters is I did my research on YouTube, right? And it creates extrinsic motivation. And it, of course, creates an antagonistic relationship between students and their universities and the professors. We can also talk a little bit about the internationalization of higher education. This slide really resonates a lot more in the US and especially in Australia, where they have almost a quarter of their university population now is coming from other parts of coming from Asia. And so they are really struggling to figure out how best to serve those international students, right? And so I don't want to talk too much about this, but I'll say one of the most interesting challenges is where I started this talk, which is that it's really hard to study in a language that you're not fluent in. And the pressures that creates some very serious incentives toward academic misconduct. Secondarily, the stakes are tremendously high. I say this to my American citizen colleagues, who are my non-immigrant American citizen colleagues, all the time. Imagine if your physical presence in this country were dependent on your grades, right? Depending on where you're from and what your family context is, it's literally a life and death situation. For most of our international students, it's not that, but it's very much about their self-image and about their family structures and about the money they've spent to be in the US or Australia, right? And I imagine this is true in a Ukrainian context. It's applicable. So those students, the pressure, the stakes are very high. And so that neutralizes almost any value they have when it's literally a matter of family honor or safety. So to wrap up this part, and I can take some questions afterward, academic integrity is complicated, right? To tell you why students cheat in an hour, it can't be done. right? But I wanted to give you a little bit of a tour of some of the key factors that I think that people have identified as among the most important. Right? There are multiple intersecting causes, and if you want to stop academic misconduct, you have to address it in a way that respects this complexity. You can't just ostracize and kick out the cheaters, because that could be all of us. You can't rely on simplistic punishment structures, because students aren't sensitive to punishment if they don't think it'll happen. There has to be an approach that includes teaching and learning. In other words, we have to change the way we teach if we expect to change the way students learn. It's that simple. We need to work on student development. We need to work on both of their ethical development and also their study skills. If we ask them to do things they don't believe they can do, we put them at risk of finding other ways. Having said all of this, we shouldn't coddle our students exclusively. Those honest students get very frustrated, quite understandably, when they feel like we're babying the students who are misbehaving. It's absolutely critical that we have policies that are fair and firm, and that we stick to those policies. And lastly, we have to have this conversation beyond just us in the universities. We have to have this conversation in politics, in families, in the media, because what we're really talking about is corruption fundamentally, and that's something that is not just a problem to be addressed at universities. And so there I'll stop. I saw a lot of interesting advanced questions, and I imagine there's a lot floating through your own heads. Let me also say that through the American councils, we're doing a lot of work, practical work with universities about what to do about academic misconduct. And so I know that this talk didn't really cover a lot of the sort of the tips, tricks, and policy changes, but rest assured that that information is coming as well. So I will actually stop the slides now and look forward to addressing questions for a few minutes.
Thank you, David. I will be asking questions in Ukrainian, so our participants can understand from Ukrainian, okay? Дуже вам дякую, колеги, за активну переписку. Маємо запитання від слухачки пані Інна Чухно. Загалом результати наведених досліджень говорять про те, що загальна культура, зокрема культура академічної доброчесності в університеті чи іншому закладі освіти, є одним із визначальних факторів ефективності інших заходів в цій сфері. Чи можна говорити про необхідність формування культури академдоброчесності у всіх сферах суспільства і на всіх рівнях освіти? Чи лише у межах закладу вищої освіти на студентів?
Oh, what a great question. Yeah, I completely agree with the premise of the question that everything we do around academic integrity has to do with the culture both at your institution and within which the institution is embedded. So I will not pretend to speak to the the overall Ukrainian cultural context, right? That there are far more expertise in the Zoom room in that context. But what I will say, by way of analogy to the U.S. context, it's a challenge right now in the U.S. I think that our context is very utilitarian right now. It's much more about getting ahead and wealth and less about public good. It's very difficult to have conversations about public good now, even in the face of a pandemic, and it's startling and disappointing. Having said that, universities can play a pivotal role in changing the culture of an entire country, right? There's no question about that. There's so many historical examples of revolutions, both metaphorical and literal, that have happened starting with students. And we as the faculty and as the administrators have the opportunity to support our students in transforming the culture that we're in. So the bad news is that if you have an unhealthy academic integrity culture, it's going to self-perpetuate. The good news is for every student you prevent from cheating, you're actually preventing 1.75 students from cheating, right? Because cheating's contagious. So just like COVID, if you wear a mask, you don't just stop your case, but you stop all the cases that would have come downstream from you. So the answer to this, the answer to how do you address culture at an institution is pervasively. It's not like an inoculation. There's no vaccine for academic integrity, I'm afraid to tell you. What that means is you have to start with your students when they come in. Obviously, it would be even better to start with them while they're still in secondary school if you do outreach programs. Help them from day one to understand what's expected of them and to create a community among the students that includes you as the administration, but really students who, if they understand how their behavior impacts one another, that's going to have a profound impact on how they choose to behave when they're by themselves. So helping them see academic integrity as a community related effort. Help them understand that the prestige of their university is dependent on the quality of their graduates. And that if you go to a prestigious school but you leave without any skills, everyone's going to find out soon enough. And help them to understand sort of the value of working together when it's appropriate, making connections in their work, and really just becoming an authentic learner. So turn the conversation around to what you shouldn't do to what you get out of this authentic learning. And this can happen in every class. Spend a few minutes in your courses talking about why this learning matters to you personally, why, how you can connect it to life. For every activity, every assessment you ask your students to do, make sure they understand how it connects to other things. Give them control over these assignments so that they can have the ability to write and do things that they care about and that will allow them to create their authentic voices. Now, this is not to say give up control. Well, this is to say give up some control over your classes. But you will be amazed at how much the quality of work increases and how much the growth and learning happens when you allow students to some extent be the captains of their own ship. It's quite remarkable what changes. Those are the things that you can do. Start by example, right? Making these changes in your own classes, creating space for your faculty, if you are an administrator, to make these changes. Rigidity, they feel rigidity as control. And no one wants to be controlled.
Дуже дякую за відповідь. Я бачу, що особливо нам сподобалося порівняння заразності списування. Дуже вдале, як на мене, порівняння. Маємо ще одне запитання, і якщо ви маєте запитання, будь ласка, пишіть їх в чаті, я їх озвучу. Які санкції застосовуються до американських студентів у випадку підтвердження факту недоброчесності? Колеги говорять, що в когось вімкнений мікрофон. Вимкніть, будь ласка. Дякую.
I have to say, you never asked me any small questions, do you? The answer to that question ranges from virtually nothing to expulsion from the institution. So let me give you some context for that answer, which is to say, I'd say that the typical American institution is, well, many American institutions live in denial. And so they like to try, their strategy for dealing with academic integrity is the ostrich strategy. So if you don't see it, it's not there. I'd say the best US institutions use a series of escalating sanctions that are appropriate to the developmental stage of the student, to the actual behavior that was being sanctioned for, and with the idea that our primary goal is not to be gatekeepers, but to, if we brought these students in, we brought them in because we believe they can be successful. And so we want to graduate successful academics. So for example, speaking from my own university context, if we have a student who, say, cut and pastes a paragraph from someone else's work into their work, let's assume that they don't cite it at all, right? So like, let's say incompetent citation, I almost hesitate to even call academic misconduct. It's academic incompetence. And we want to just teach them how to use a citation, penalize them through the normal grading structures because that's incompetence. But let's say they take something from Wikipedia, paste it into an assignment that's not supposed to use outside sources, right? If this is a first-year student in their first few college courses, that we want to respond to that somewhat differently than this is a senior who fully well understands that they shouldn't be doing it, but are choosing it as a strategic response. And so in the first case, we'd probably give them an educational sanction, 0 on the assignment, which is much worse than a failing grade, right? Because a failing grade, you'd probably get half the points. So you'd get none of the points. Sometimes you'd be asked to redo the assignment properly for no points. And you'd get an educational sanction, like an 8-hour course on academic integrity. And if there's understanding that it was done because of lack of academic competence or time management or something, then they might be given a course on that as well. But then you get a student who, say, cheats on an exam, looks out on the work of another student. This starts to escalate, right? It's putting another student at risk because now they're going to have similar work. Now they might lose credit for the entire course. And course in this case is, say, 1 year in one discipline. We're not talking about an entire university degree. Just want to make sure our terminology is there. And if you start to see repeat sanctions at our institution, for example, you'd have a permanent record of this after the second time. And if the behavior continued, they'd be dismissed. I think a student who bought a paper online and submitted it as their own and was found would probably either be suspended for a year or dismissed without any prior context, without any prior cases. So it really, and this is one university, but I think we're probably somewhere in the middle. I think it's really important that when you sanction, you keep in mind a few things. Number one, it has to be worse to get caught than not get caught, right? So the sanction has to be worse than just not doing the work. Otherwise, you're creating a very bad economic theory situation. Number two, the student has to have the ability to grow, learn, and change from this behavior if that seems possible. And number three, you have to give the student the opportunity to repair the community of trust. So an apology letter or something relevant to the behavior. Sometimes it just means having to take some time away from the institution. But in general, we want the student to be successful, right? We're educators, we're not gatekeepers. I mean, to some extent, we're gatekeepers. But when you think about your role as an educator, you're gonna do a much better job for your students.
Ми маємо підняту руку. Я не впевнена, чи це запитання з зали. Якщо це запитання, Тарасун прізвище слухача чи слухачки з піднятою рукою, якщо у вас є запитання. Але, можливо, це випадковість. Ще одне запитання. Опишіть схематично процедури розгляду справ про порушення та хто є відповідальною особою або яка відповідальна структура в проведенні процедури. Дякую.
Great question. There's a wide range in the U.S. One of the fundamental features of U.S. higher education is that it's surprisingly unregulated to an international view. So many U.S. states have some regulations about how these things work, but for the most part, U.S. universities are not regulated in the way you would expect. We're accredited by independent bodies, so it's not even, and those independent bodies are regulated by the government. So it's very secondary. So the diversity of these procedures is tremendous. I'd say there are three basic categories. One is they're adjudicated by a set of administrators, either a single administrator or a panel, depending on the institution. And those administrators sometimes aren't even academic administrators. They come from areas like student life. I'm not a big fan of that. I wouldn't recommend that. But to have, I think some of the best policies are run by academic integrity professionals at the university. I think of, for example, Kansas State University, where my friend Camilla, Dr. Roberts, teaches or works. She runs an office of professionals whose job it is to address these cases. Another option is to have faculty, for the most part, manage these cases. When those faculty do that on their own, I think that tends to lead to a great deal of unfairness, because it really depends on which faculty member you wind up running afoul of as a student. So I prefer a situation where faculty have input into an overall process run by, say, a faculty committee that is able to sort of oversee a process and make sure there's some consistency in application of policy. And then there's a student-run system. I work in a student-run system. It's a sort of a weird historical legacy of our institution that we have a student committee that's elected by the student body that adjudicates these cases. And you might imagine that they're quite lenient, and sometimes they are, but you can also imagine that they get quite outraged when students do things that that feel unfair. I actually think it's great because they have a lot of student buy-in. That our student population as a whole really believes in our system, and that's partly because they know that they have a voice in it. If I were building a system from scratch, which many of your universities has the opportunity to do this, I would probably build a hybrid of the last two. So I would create a university, actually of all three, I'd create a university structure, if you have a big enough university, where you have an academic integrity professional whose job it is to design and maintain the policies and communicate about it, and also to organize a faculty-student joint committee to do a lot of the work that goes along with adjudicating and administering these cases, because it can be a lot of work. Once you start to build an active and successful process, you start to get a lot of cases very quickly. And the good news is they tend to be very minor cases. You get tons of minor cases, and the result of that is you stop getting the more serious cases because students learn before they go down a really bad road. So it's actually works out okay in that case, but it can be a fair bit of resources. But yeah, I think having faculty and students involved, but having an administrator be giving them support and structure is probably the best way to go. But the most important thing is to have somebody whose job it is to keep an eye on academic integrity on your campus. It doesn't have to be full-time, but it does have to be someone who has that accountability and has that across the whole campus vision to see what the situation is.
У нас є запитання з аудиторії. Пані Людмила запитувала, чи можна озвучити її запитання. Пані Людмило, прошу.
Добрий вечір. Я соціолог, професор соціології із Харкова. І моє питання стосується наступного. Скажіть, будь ласка, чи зіткалися ви в вашому дослідженні з проблемою, як корелює кривда чи обман, який надходить від викладача щодо якихось соціальних питань, освітніх, методичних, можливо, навіть змістовних у предметі, в якому його викривають студенти, і як це корелює з їх подальшою поведінкою? Дякую за відповідь.
That's a fabulous question. One of the unfortunate aspects of the work that has been done in the US on academic integrity is that it's really split. So there's the faculty misconduct literature on the one hand, and there's the student misconduct literature on the other hand. And it's strange how little they communicate with each other. And so I don't actually have a good answer for you, except to say that the tolerance for faculty misconduct in this country is, well, how should I put it? Public, if it's made public, you have a big problem, but it's effectively covered up, I think, pretty well. So a lot of the misconduct that happens, you never hear about. In terms of research misconduct, I'm not even going to continue because I don't know enough about it to say something intelligent. But that's a great question, and I think that's an area for a good deal more explanation of what happens when students lose faith in their instructor as a person of integrity? I think that's a huge question. I can tell you when they lose faith in their instructor as an instructor of integrity, when they feel like the faculty member does things like cuts corners, doesn't do a good job teaching, uses standardized materials, things like that, cheating goes way up in those situations. So I wouldn't be surprised to discover that that happens in other kinds of misconduct as well. And that's not misconduct, that's just not, laziness.
Маємо ще одне цікаве запитання. Чи існують у вашому середовищі, я так розумію, в американському середовищі, санкції до надмірно добрих викладачів, які поблажливо ставляться до академічної недоброчесності студентів?
Oh, what a great question. No. Short answer. So many institutions, like mine, for example, you would be punished if you tried to take a case of academic integrity on by yourself. My institution has a very clear policy that says faculty are not to unilaterally handle cases of academic misconduct. We have a university-wide process, and we're expected to use it. Now, has anyone ever been punished for that? No. But what happens is that their grades can be overturned if that happens, and that's no faculty member wants that. Like, that's the worst thing that can happen. Having said all of that, we have a very strong culture of faculty academic freedom in this country. And so, as a general rule, your class, your grade. Unless you violate an explicit policy, faculty can give grades whatever we want. If I decide tomorrow that I'm going to use a class structure such that my students all get top marks, I'll probably have a very interesting conversation with my dean, but at the end of the day, he doesn't really have any control over what my grades are. That's just not the way the structure works. Having said that, there are other things that the dean has complete control over and that I could lose my job for, right? So for example, if I don't show up to teach my classes, it's over, it's done. If I, misconduct with students in other kind of contexts, if I'm abusive to them, for example. So there are some things where I have no freedom and other places where I have complete freedom. But grades are one where, no, the only way I saw an administrator could have any kind. So that's, of course, for me, I'm a tenured full professor. If I were a contingent faculty, then the situation's very different. And it's worth noting that in the US, a huge percentage of our faculty do not have the protections of tenure that I have. And so they are under a lot of pressure from administrators and students alike, right? So if you're a faculty member whose contract is renewed each year or each term, it's possible to, if you give grades that are too low, students complain about you, you lose your job. Conversely, if you give too many high grades, your department chair will have that interesting conversation with you. So for these contingent faculty, they really have to walk a fine line. But yeah, no, one of the things you asked, and that's such a great question, because I would have never thought of that, because in the US, that's just a very different way. The structure works very differently in that regard. It's fascinating to me, and it's one of the reasons I love doing this work, is because learning from all of you about sort of challenges my own assumptions about how universities must work, right? I would love to see much more engagement from government and from society in how our universities work. And I know not all my colleagues would agree with that, but perhaps there is such a thing as too much as well. So it's a matter of finding the balance.
Маємо ще декілька запитань в чаті. Чи могли б ви навести приклад порушення академдоброчесності, яке найчастіше не сприймається студентами як порушення?
Yeah, we could do that all day. I would start with the really boring cases. So when faculty do a bad job of explaining what the rules of the road are in our classes is the most common case. I see a half dozen cases a year where a computer science class will have 3 collaborative homeworks and 3 non-collaborative homeworks. And if the student doesn't notice which one it is and they work together, it's misconduct. It's black letter law, right? If it says on the assignment, you may not work with someone, but on the previous assignment you could, it's not hard to see how a student could make that mistake. Of course, many of them will tell you that that's just a mistake when really it was a deliberate lack of, they decided not to follow the rules, right? It's hard to know which is which. I'd say that there's a lot of plagiarism. I'd say that the most common version is what I call incompetence plagiarism, right? So a lot of our students don't really understand the notion of paraphrasing, right? So they feel like they change synonyms out, whereas they keep the same ideas in the same sentence structure in the same order, but they change out important for critical, right? Or pick any other synonyms you like. And they do that a few times, and then they put a citation at the bottom. The implication being that it's the idea came from the paper that they're citing, but the words are their own. But of course, the words are not really their own in any meaningful way. Now that's plagiarism. There's no question, and it's misconduct. But is there an intent to be deceptive there? Probably not. It's probably just incompetence in, and I use the word incompetence in English. That has a very harsh connotation, but I really mean it in the most literal sense. They're not capable of doing the work that we're asking them to do. And so anytime it happens where we ask them to do something and they can't do it the way we ask them to do it, and so they do their best to do it, but what they do turns out to be misconduct, I would argue that's a pedagogical issue, not an ethical or a punitive issue, right? And so you've got to be careful when designing academic integrity policy, because plagiarism is bad and they need to not do that. But if the response to, here's a great example. I had a student in our nursing program come in, and she did basically what I just described. She had a big old paragraph that came from a paper that she read, that she tried to paraphrase. It was a terrible job. There was the reference to the paper at the end of it. And this is a student who was a full-time nurse, professional nurse, who was going back for a bachelor's in nursing. So she had a full-time job, was already doing very similar work. But what that means is she was not able to use the resources that universities provide to traditional students because she was working all day and going to school in the evening. So she wanted, if you want to say to her, you should have gone to the writing center, you should have seen your professor. She tried. So she literally did all the things you would ask a student to do, except she wasn't able to competently paraphrase the source. Now, what is an appropriate response to this behavior? I think the appropriate response to this behavior is to put a big red circle on the paper and say, this is bad paraphrasing, and staple a paraphrasing worksheet to it and say, maybe we need to work on this, or bring her to your office and work on it if that's possible, right? A punishment for that, and a bad grade, of course, because it's not good work. But to engage in an institutional disciplinary process for not being able to paraphrase work seems very, very inappropriate to me. It defeats the purpose, which is to graduate a successful, educated nurse, which is absolutely something she can be. So I guess that's an example, and I think there's lots of examples of cases where students are trying their best to do the right thing, and they just aren't able to do it. And I think that's distinctive from students who try their best, are unable to do it, and then consciously make a choice to do something else. Right? I can't do this math problem. I don't know what to do. I'm going to Google it. I'm going to type it into Chegg, whatever. Try to figure out a way around actually doing what I'm asked to do. That's different. And I think it's qualitatively different. And if you can identify that difference in a particular case, you should handle it differently.
Дуже дякуємо за таку розгорнуту, дуже цікаву відповідь. Маємо ще декілька запитань. На вашу думку, чи можна переспрямувати енергію від академічної недоброчесності, переорієнтувати її в продуктивний напрямок?
Yes, absolutely. I'm a strong believer in redirecting that energy. So ask yourself this question: what is the opposite of academic misconduct? Right? It's kind of a hard question, right? It seems obvious. The opposite of cheating is not cheating. The opposite of cheating is authentic learning. Right? And you can define authentic in lots of different ways, but the gist of what I'm saying here is, instead of worrying about stopping students from cheating, try to get them to learn from the work that we have them do. And this will, by its very nature, reduce academic misconduct. And so part of what this is doing is getting away from the notion that teaching matters. Teaching is secondary to learning, and it always has to be secondary to learning. I sometimes, if I'm feeling provocative, say no one ever taught anybody anything. And I should highlight the fact that I have a Ph.D. in cognitive psychology. So the fact that I say this is kind of controversial. But the bottom line here is that there's nothing you can do to teach a student who isn't learning. Right? You have to start, as you design your work for your students, to design it as it's informed by learning theories, by the science of teaching and learning, by cognitive psychology, and by social psychology, and developmental psychology too, as well as the key points from your disciplines. Sociology has a lot to say about this. Economics has a lot to say about it. The STEM disciplines all have a lot to say. But if you start from that basis, rather than from the what have we always done in training our students as the basis, you'll come to some very different conclusions. I sometimes say the simplest thing you can do to improve academic integrity is take that big multiple choice exam that you give and take the same questions and just break it down into a weekly quiz. Just change the schedule. You don't even have to change the questions, although you should change the questions. Because that will lead to spaced rather than massed learning. It will lead to lower pressure from the students. It'll lead to higher self-efficacy. It'll have all these great outcomes, and you haven't done anything but change the schedule of evaluation. Right? It's no more work for you if you're giving the exact same questions on a different schedule. So that's a very simple, dumb version of it. But you can start to build lots and lots of ways to change your courses to make them pedagogically more effective and more learner-focused rather than teacher-focused. And if you do that, by their nature, you're going to have less misconduct. Let me be clear, that's not going to solve the problem, right? But what we're doing is we're raising the price for these students in these situations. We're making learning cheaper and misconduct more expensive. But it's not the only solution, right? As I said, it's a complex multifactorial problem. But yeah, teach better would be a great place to start. Redirect the energy toward teaching and learning. Which, by the way, for you administrators in the Zoom room, means you got to support your faculty in changing the way they teach by providing pedagogical training, by giving time to retool courses, teaching assistants, all of those resources. Retooling classes doesn't come for free.
Дякуємо. Маємо ще одне запитання. Я підозрюю, надзвичайно болюче для нашого спікера. Як заклади та викладачі борються з ghostwriterами, ghostwriting?
Yep. There's a couple of terms for this in English. We've used contract cheating has become popular, ghostwriting. Sometimes it's called assignment outsourcing. One of the things that's interesting about this is that it's not always paid for. Oftentimes it's bartered between students or even done within a family. Right? You hear stories of one family member who's really a capable writer writing all the work for all of the members of the members of the extended family. And let me tell you, this is an intractable problem from a technological standpoint, right? This isn't just like finding plagiarism using a search engine, right? If someone else writes an original paper, it's going to be very difficult to detect that from a simple search technological solution. The first thing to do is what you've already done, which is acknowledge that this is a problem, right? If you believe the Australian data, it could be as much as 10% of students who are employing these services on a regular basis. I think context matters a lot. I think they oversimplify the situation a little bit, but they're not wrong. So first step is acknowledging the problem. Second step is having a robust investigation system, so that, particularly so that faculty can not spend all of our time investigating these cases. And I'm not an expert on investigation. I tend to focus more on the preventative side, but there are definitely folks who are, and using the tools that they have, you can make a reasonable case a lot of the time that a student didn't write a paper. There are also some pedagogical solutions to this, like having students write like in class or on-demand reflections about their research process, for example. It's very difficult to do that if you didn't actually do the research. Oral responses to their own work are very effective. You can also just ask them to write a very brief restatement of one of the key points in their paper, and then you can compare the writing style to see if they're the same or different. Right? So these are all technical options, but they also have some pedagogical value too. To ask a student to reflect on their own work process can be a very informative thing for them to do. But don't let it be so sensitive. It is the latest problem to deal with. As technology grows, it's always going to be applied to the things that we care about. In this case, academic integrity is something that society cares about, right? Just technology has been used. I mean, as I joked sometimes, since the first monks were complaining about these new modern styluses that made it easier to copy the manuscripts, right? It's been going on as long as there's been written culture, that we've had technology influencing people's behavior and having other folks saying, well, this is cheating, right? So this is not new, and this is not scandalous. I mean, the behavior is scandalous, but the technology isn't. The technology is just what it is. On the front end, it's a teaching and learning problem. On the back end, it's a detection, policy, and investigation problem. And it can be addressed in both places.
Thank you, David. Маємо питання від пана Сергія. Пане Сергію, прошу, озвучте. Пан Сергій Пастушенко хотів... прошу, пане Сергію. Вас не чути чомусь. І так, на жаль, не чути.
А так чуть чи ні?
А так чуть.
Дякую. Тоді тут багато є шарів захисту для того, щоб не вийти. Питання до пана Девіда, воно стосується наступного. Якщо, наприклад, ми чули від пана Девіда, що дуже серйозно, і він наводив такі приклади, впливає середовище, в якому виховуються студенти на їх наступну поведінку. Я маю на увазі в середовищі там своєї групи і таке інше. От, ми чули про те, що якщо є якийсь з них суб'єкт, який має як вигодонабувач, обманом досягає чогось, от, і він це тиражує в певному середовищі студентів, то це середовище реагує на це, ну, з точки зору свого досягнення позитивно, з точки зору доброчесності реагує негативно. Питання стосується наступного. Ну от я так для того, щоб пану Девіду було зрозуміло, наведу йому просто два приклади. Може він на прикладі цього університету зможе пояснити. От, наприклад, як впливає морально-етичне, духовне виховання студентів може не тільки в університеті, а до цього я маю на увазі в родині, в школі. От є різниця між поведінкою студентів, які мають різні рівні морально-етично-духовного виховання по відношенню до академічної доброчесності. Наприклад, я кажу, наприклад, студенти IT університету Роберта Оуерла, да, і студенти IT університету, будь-якого світського іншого університету Сполучених Штатів Америки. Дякую.
That's a great question, and a complicated one too. So let's start with this. If a student has a strong moral basis and a religious basis for their morals is great, but it's certainly not the only version. Then if a student has a strong moral basis and a strong understanding of ethics, that's a great thing towards reducing academic misconduct. However, and Jason Stevens has talked about this work a lot in his work, not particularly related to religion, moral disengagement is a huge factor here. In other words, if you don't see the behavior as wrong, then that strong moral upbringing doesn't even enter into the equation, right? So a friend of yours says, I'm struggling in math. Can I see your homework? If you don't immediately register this as a moral question, then it doesn't really matter whether you have a strong moral upbringing or not. If you just say, oh, my friend needs help, of course I'm going to help my friend, then that leads to a problem because that moral upbringing doesn't play into it. In fact, that's how those honor codes that I was telling you about in the US came into being, is that there was a code of ethics among the early Americans in our colonial era to help a friend and to make sure no one gets left behind. And that ethos was stronger than the ethos to do your work yourself. And so the faculty at the College of William and Mary, which is one of our first universities, said we need to change this ethos. We need to engage people's ethical thinking into academic misconduct. And so they made the students promise on each assignment that they had done the work themselves with integrity. And of course, then the ethics of keeping your promises were engaged. So I think the answer to this question is if your student, so first of all, people with strong moral values cheat all the time, right? And there's lots of reasons why this might be, but in general, they fall into this category of neutralizing attitudes, right? So students are able to either disengage, this behavior doesn't have a moral component, or this particular situation is an exception to the rule, or I'm an exception to the rule. But so, yeah, so yes, neutralizing attitudes are the mechanism by which students or all of us humans circumvent our own strong moral values. Let me add one more thing to be concerned about, which is I taught at an explicitly religious school for the first part of my career, my own religion to point out for the purposes of the conversation. And one of the things that worried me is that the students were taking such a strong religious studies program that they didn't really think that the work they were doing in their secular studies was that important. And I was worried that once their religious studies faculty were emphasizing how important religious studies were and how not important my stuff was, that they would take that as a license to circumvent the normal rules. Because if you look at it this way, if religious studies is your sacred obligation, if my psychology homework is taking away from your time spent on your sacred obligation, then that's an appeal to a higher principle. And that's, I can sort of see the perspective that comes from that. So it's the critical thing in any context, but a religious context highlights it, I think, is that it's very important for us as faculty, in no matter what our context, to highlight the impact of students' behaviors on others and to highlight their own moral values. Timely reminders, that honor code study that I talked about in the talk, it makes students promise that they did the right thing. And all of that will sort of trigger the moral schema as opposed to the utilitarian schema that you might otherwise see.
Thank you, David. Дуже дякую, колеги, вам за запитання. Як я вже писала в чаті, на жаль, час нашого спікера обмежений, у нього попереду ще робочий день, у нас з вами вже його завершення. Тож я дякую вам за запитання, я знаю, що деякі з них ще залишилися, проте запитання, яке стосувалося кодексів доброчесності, я запрошую ознайомитися з цією інформацією у нас на веб-сайті. Ми надішлемо вам його разом з покликанням на запис цього відео. У нас є окремо присвячені інформаційні бюлетені і рекомендації до розробки і впровадження кодексів доброчесності, про які якраз йшлося в запитанні. А запитання про перефразування, воно, вочевидь, потребує навіть, напевно, що окремого цілого вебінару з цього приводу, взагалі, доречності таких речей і настільки масштабних завдань. І ми подумаємо над тим, аби зорганізувати окрему зустріч і обговорити різні типи завдань, які підштовхують або унеможливлюють академічну недоброчесність. Тож, ще раз дякую Девіду Реттінджеру за сьогоднішню цікаву лекцію. Дуже дякую нашій перекладачці пані Інні за переклад. Спасибі моїм колегам сьогодні присутнім тут, які допомагали, Анастасія, Євгенія і Ольга, які допомагали і моніторили всі ваші запитання. І вам, звісно, за участь, за цікаву дискусію, за те, що провели цих майже 2 години разом з нами. І ми будемо інформувати вас про подальші заходи і радо запрошуватимемо вас долучатися до них. Отже, дуже вам дякую, гарного вам вечора, Девіду, гарного дня і на все добре.
Дякую.